Hey everyone, this is Louis7, and today I have a quick guide on imbuing legendary items in the Lord of the Rings Online. The focus of this guide is to cover what you need to do in preparing your allies for imbuing and what can wait until after. There is a lot of confusion just going on and inconsistent or even misleading sometimes information available on the topic, also a lot of outdated stuff, so hopefully this video can help give accurate and up-to-date information on the imbuement process. For the structure of the guide, first we will overview the imbuement system, then I will break down what you need to do to get your ally ready before imbuement, then what you can wait to do after, and after all that I will summarize my personal strategy with imbued allies, then we will actually take a more detailed look into legacies, and finally I'll end on how you can get some of the ally boosting items that you need. But to start off, the imbuement system begins at level 100. Legendary items themselves have a cap at level 100 and you will not get any more at higher levels after 100. So to continue upgrading and advancing the ally, you will need to imbue it and work through that system. The imbued allies will stay with you as your characters continue to level and progress after level 100, so you won't need to go around replacing them every few levels like before 100. The imbuement system does require a lot of effort to maintain a good amount of power on your ally as your character levels up, so you can actually stay in line with the difficulty of the content, whether that is landscape or group content. In short, imbuing your ally is just very important past level 100 for your character's power level, and making a good imbued ally is also going to be much more helpful for your character than a poorly imbued ally, and this is something that is not really explained all that well in the game anywhere, so players generally have to rely on external sources for ally information such as videos like this. So, after all that, we need to discuss what imbuing your ally actually does to it. First, it converts the ally into a new leveling system. Just as pre-imbuement, you put in starlit crystals to increase the maximum tier of the primary legacy, which basically means the maximum legacy level by tier. And the primary legacy is the first one listed and is things like DPS, tactical damage rating, tactical healing rating, incoming healing rating, and things like that. In general, those are the most impactful ones for your character, especially with leveling using starlit crystals to boost the maximum possible DPS, or if you're a tactical class, the tactical damage rating for like runekeepers, for example. But the other major component that works mostly the same is to increase the maximum level of a secondary legacy, which these are also called class legacies, by the way. You use scrolls of empowerment to do so. You can have a total of 7 of these class legacies, and as shown on the screen, these legacies are the type that boost skill damage or like a certain type of damage, healing, some ratings maybe, they may just affect certain skills, and just all sorts of class specific things like that. So, the Starlit Crystals and Scrolls of Empowerment, they increase the maximum possible tiers of the legacies. To actually level those legacies up, you need item XP. And imbued allies, I will say, take a ton of item XP to actually level up. But also, I must point out that a freshly imbued ally that needs a ton of XP and it needs to be leveled up still, for most players that will actually end up being better than a completely maxed out non-imbued ally, so it's still worth it even if you have to put in all that XP effort. And also just item XP in general is something your character will naturally gain a lot of through like questing and leveling, and character XP, getting that stuff, you'll usually get item XP at the same time. So it's not really something to worry about overall. The real grind in progression with the imbued allies is going to be using scrolls and crystals to increase the max tiers of the legacies. But that is all that changes with imbued allies, actually, really just the legacies and how their tiers and how leveling them works. Relics in their system stay the exact same, so it doesn't change for unimbued versus imbued allies, and the same is actually true for titles. I should point out though that you can imbue both your legendary items, so for example like a hunter would imbue both a melee weapon and their bow, so both for any class will be imbuable, and that is generally what you will want to do. So the final thing to cover in this section is how to actually imbue your legendary item. And you can do this at any Forge Master, so you just go to the Forge Master and you can do that there. But before actually imbuing it, we do need to cover what you need to do to prepare your ally for imbuement, and I will say the very quick version right here that I have for y'all is to first get the legacies you want, second apply a scroll of delving and level the LI to 70, and third you can imbue. But let's actually get into more details on all of that. And I will say, all of the advice that I give and that you find like anywhere else, All of it is to save you resources and time, especially in the long run. Everything you do to prepare an LI for imbuing can be done afterwards. It's just some of the steps can be very easy actually to do pre-imbuement and save a lot of time and effort compared to doing it if done afterwards, especially a few particular steps. But also, I do want to point out, using a first stage legendary item for imbuement will be most efficient. That's why most people do that. But you can actually use a third or second age. It will just save you a little bit of a grind in the long run by using a first stage. And I will also say that getting a first stage level 100 LI is fairly easy and cheap nowadays, so it's definitely worth that little bit of extra effort maybe to get the first stage. But let's actually go ahead and get into the process. And first, the most important thing is getting the legacies you want. Now, you should be aware that some legacies do change what they do after the LI is imbued. So there are actually some legacies that may be useful pre-imbuement but are actually not good post-imbuement. As mentioned in the beginning, I will have a section on legacies for people less familiar with how that works after we cover the imbuement process right now, and that'll be in the next section. Second, it is good to level your LI all the way to the max, but it is most important to at least get it to level 30, because after the first 3 reforges, which doing level 30 will let you do 3 reforges, you will get new legacies for each of those. So level 30 will unlock all 6 base legacies, so that's the most important as far as leveling goes. But at this point, everything else is more or less optional actually, and will just save resources, time, and effort in the long run again. But if you want to do the bare minimum, you just need to get the right legacies and get the LI to at least level 30 and reforge it 3 times before you imbue. But next up on the list I have is if you apply a Scroll of Delving before imbuement and level your LI all the way up to level 70, that will save you a single Scroll of Empowerment in the long run, because at level 70, that reforge you upgrade the tier of a legacy, which translates to a single max tier level increase once imbued, and again that is exactly what a single Scroll of Empowerment gets you. So specifically, I do want to point out this is an Amphila Scroll of Delving, the level 100 version, and the most reliable way I have found to get that is for marks and medallions at the legendary item vendor in the skirmish camp, or you can also look on the auction house to see if another player has one for sale. Anyway, the last thing to do before imbuing is very minor effect overall, and it also only affects certain LI types, and that is to apply 3 Starlit Crystals before imbuing. The only effect that this has is on LIs with passive stats such as the Runekeeper Runestone or like a champion 2-handed weapon, and it very barely affects the stats, and by the time you actually even get to like level 115 or higher than that, especially like the level cap at 130, those stats are very negligible anyway. So this is something that is not ultimately important, but somebody who does want the absolute max for their LI, technically doing 3 Starlit Crystals before imbuing will give you a tiny bit of help, and again this is for the specific LIs that actually have the passive stats anyway. And I personally do not find it worth the effort to make sure I absolutely do this before, but if you do have the extra Starlit Crystals lying around, you could go ahead and use them before you imbue, and I included this part, it's a little bit longer part in this guide just because of all the details here, because it is technically better, but really overall I don't think it's worth all the effort. It's something like even just 40 morale is how much more you could get doing this, so it's really minor. Anyway, everything else can be done afterwards, including Scrolls of Empowerment and the rest of the Starlit Crystals. Just to repeat that, applying Scrolls of Empowerment and Starlit Crystals does not matter if you do it before or after imbuing as far as max legacy tier goes, and it's good to imbue early in general with your LI just because of the massive amount of power it unlocks again that really boosts up your LI and the strength and ultimately the power of your character. But that actually brings us to what you need to do after imbuing your LI. And to point out, because the goal for this is to be a quick guide, I won't go into great detail on sources of like scrolls and crystals and that type of stuff. I will point out a few good places again at the last section of this video, but the general post-imbuement process is actually relatively simple. First, you need to use a Crystal of Remembrance to unlock the 7th and final legacy. Now, to be complete, you can use the Crystal of Remembrance pre-imbuement, but it is easier to do post-imbuement because if you do it after imbuing, you will get an open legacy slot, which you can just pick the legacy you want for that. You don't have to go through the usual deconstruct an LI with a legacy you want to get a legacy scroll to put that on the LI. You don't have to go through that process, so doing it afterwards saves the effort and is honestly just a lot more convenient in my opinion. And also, in case you do imbue an LI before the 3rd reforge that we talked about earlier, just to point out, you would actually need to apply multiple Crystals of Remembrance to unlock more tiers. And the Crystals of Remembrance, they are very hard to get. There's actually no reliable way to farm these in-game. That said, Book 3, Chapter 7 of Volume 4 will reward you with an Amethyst Crystal of Remembrance, so the best way to get more of these outside of that, instead of relying on like Lucky Instants or Epic Battle Drop, is to actually buy one from the auction hall from other players, and that really depends on your server and if people actually sell them. But moving on, the second thing you need to do is apply just more Starlight Crystals to increase the max tier of the primary legacy. As covered before and a lot throughout this is just in general will be very important for your character and their power. As an exception, I do want to point out that at the least, the Guardian Belt Shield rank legacy I know is 100% useless and does nothing at all. So please, if you are a Guardian, please don't waste crystals on the Guardian Belt. But that aside, the third thing you need to do is Scrolls of Empowerment to rank up the maximum tier of the class or secondary legacies. And the final thing you need to do is just get item XP to actually level the LI. Now, there are some other things. As mentioned earlier, relics and titles are the same before and after imbuement, so I should point out with these that as you get to higher level regions, there will be better titles and relics that you will come across. So these are things that you will just naturally replace as your character progresses, both in leveling and end game. And again, those don't matter before or after imbuement. But that actually wraps up what you do before and after imbuing your LI. And before we move on, I do want to summarize my strategy for efficiency, and it's very short. First, I do get the legacies I want. Second, I use a Scroll of Delving, and third, I level the LI to 70, and then fourth, I imbue it. So that is a super short version again of how you can prepare your LI for imbuing. It's just a lot of extra details. Again, it's stuff to save you resources in the long run. But by now, you can really hopefully tell that getting the proper legacies is the most important thing in the pre-imbuement process. So let's actually cover the legacies now. First, the general way to get legacies is by deconstructing unimbued LIs, as in all the 3rd age LIs you get for your class. When you level these LIs to 30 and reforge 3 times, that will unlock 6 legacies. But when you deconstruct any LI that is level 30 plus, you will get to select a legacy to get a scroll of that. You can then use this scroll on another LI as your first stage LI, as like for example your first stage LI that is, that you are preparing to imbue. And you put that scroll on that first stage, and then that first stage will then have that legacy. That is pretty simple overall. It might seem complicated me describing it here, but if you have dealt with LIs before, you are probably already familiar with that. But there is actually one more complication in detail, and that is that there are both major and minor legacies you have to deal with. A base first stage LI will start with 3 major legacies. Then as you reforge it, it's basically RNG if you get a chance at a major and minor legacy for your next ones. But the distinction becomes important when replacing those legacies, because you can only replace minor legacies with other minor legacies, while major legacies you can actually replace with either major or minor legacies. So with that, I believe it is a good idea to first replace any minor legacies you need, and then you can move on to replacing major legacies because they're a little bit more flexible. But that is the system of legacy replacement. So one question you all might have is how you know which legacies are good and which are bad, and which change with imbuement and all that stuff. Well, unfortunately, there's no straightforward answer because it depends on your class, your spec, your build, and just what you plan to do with your character, as in if you like only want to do solo questing, or maybe you're interested in end-game raiding, or maybe you're interested in something in between and only want to work on one LI for all that. So for this section, I will unfortunately have to direct you to other resources. For my content, as in the videos I do, I don't have much on legacy guides, which that may change in the future. I might break those down like my trait guide, so if anyone does have interest in that for various classes, please do let me know in the comments so I can gauge viewer interest on something like that for the various classes again. But setting that aside, you can actually look in-game a little bit at what your legacies that you have on your LI will change into by going and starting the imbuement process. You don't actually have to click imbue on your legendary item, but if you drag that into the box in-game, your LI, it will show you what your legacies change to, so you can at least know for the legacies you have on your LI, but that still doesn't tell you about the other legacies that aren't on your LI. So I think the LOTRO wiki is actually one of the better resources to find out what pre-imbued legacies will change to for post-imbuement. So here we are at the LOTRO wiki website, and we are on, just for a sample, we are at the Beorning Legendary Legacies, and you can see the box here at the top. If you just Google actually Beorning Legendary Legacies, we can go ahead and do that. Legacies, LOTRO, that will actually take you to a Google page, and it should have the LOTRO wiki at the top, and it takes me right back where I was. But also a way to navigate to other classes. At the bottom, they have a Legacies by the class when you're on a class, and you can go to the class of interest for you. But this shows the Imbued Legacies again. It shows for weapon carving, and it shows the Pre-imbuement Legacy. So you get to see what the Imbued version does with the first 4 columns of the row, and then it shows what it does pre-imbuement, so you can know what it changes to. So like execute damage, that one's very simple. It changes right to execute damage. And then Beast Swarm, debuff duration. This is actually a significant pre-imbuement legacy for the Bannerings. It's very good pre-imbuement, but it changes to Beast Swarm critical defense debuff, which is basically useless as a post-imbuement legacy. So yeah, that is what is going on with the Bear Warning, and just an example of the Legacies again. Just to go to another page, let's randomly look at Warden, one of my favorite classes. So this is all their pre-imbued legacies, and then what they change into post-imbuement. So you can see maybe you want something like light damage. Well, that's light damage before, so that's very good. Hampering Javelin duration, again, that changes to Hampering Javelin reset chance. And then there are also all the Javelin legacies. Oddly enough, a Spear, main hand one, actually affected Javelins. But anyway, that is what is going on there, and we can go ahead and get back. So I did point out a couple things with knowing what is actually useful there, but it really, again, depends on your specific character what will be useful. One minor piece of advice that I can give is, in general, as we saw with the Bearing, legacies that give raw rating numbers typically do not scale that well with levels, so they often are not good as like a starting point. Things that like affect cooldowns, durations, and give percent changes are typically going to be the most useful. Again, this is a very general thing. It's not always going to be specific for certain classes. Specific legacies are always going to be this way. It's very general and broad advice that I can give without looking again specifically for your character. But the raw stat legacies, I should point out also, Vitality, Agility, Will, and the such, those are a little bit useful, it may seem like, at level 100, freshly imbuing your ally, but those don't really scale well with level, even at like max tier, so there are usually a lot of better options than those for most allies, at least. And I hate to say this, but besides doing your own research or asking players in-game for tailored advice specific to your build and your character, there are very limited resources available online. So one site I can actually recommend is LOTRO HQ. They have the legacy list for every class and a few recommendations for a select few in-game prioritized specs. So their lists are not really inclusive for all player types and specs, but given limited resources available, this is a great resource for players to look at and at least get ideas for what they could do with their LI. A lot of the content on that site, I should point out, is heavily oriented towards end-game progression and like doing high difficulty content that I would say is not all casual friendly, and I know a lot of my content on my channel here is more so casual and maybe beginner oriented, so I kind of stress this point here. You really should be cautious of following like everything exactly, because there are a lot of systems in LOTRO, such as weapon swapping that people do for endgame, and whether you weapon swap or not, that can actually change how you would build your allies depending on, again, if you weapon swap or not, just as an example of one thing that will be going on with that site. Anyway, that aside, again, I do want to say it is a great resource to get an idea of what could be some things to start looking at for your character. But that is all I have for legacies here, and in fact, if you have questions on your legacies, I would actually love if you comment below and maybe somebody can give you advice, and I will also reply if I'm able to help out at all, so maybe we can get some help if people do have questions on legacies down there. But moving on, for the last section of this guide, I want to include a very quick list of some good sources for crystals and scrolls that I have found, at least, because I know the real grind is with the scrolls and crystals with the LI system. And actually, before we get into that, I should cover the differences between these different scroll types that we have now, considering the recent updates to the max tier implementation. So first, there are Amphless Scrolls of Empowerment and Amphless Starlight Crystals. These can be used on any imbued or unimbued allies to increase the maximum tier of a legacy for level 100 allies specifically, up to level 100 really, so they're the only ones that work on level 100, that is. There are also these new max tier scrolls and crystals. These can only be used up until the max tier number. So at the time of this video, the overall max tier of all class legacies, for example, is 83. So a max tier 74 Scroll of Empowerment would only work on allies with a max legacy tier of 73 and below. And you would basically have to find another source for legacy tiers after that. There are also some max tier crystals that work the same way. So I know there's a little bit of confusion there, but hopefully that makes sense. But to get into some good sources for these scrolls, first, both max tier crystals and scrolls can be attained with Motes of Enchantment or Embers of Enchantment. These are only effective up to a certain point because they are the max tier variety. Motes can be earned consistently through missions, while Embers can be earned through missions run at the level cap and other various endgame Minas Morgul and beyond content level 130 stuff basically. Second, the featured instance reward boxes can also drop a couple of scrolls, and you can run these once below the level cap and once at the level cap for really 2 chances to open the reward boxes. Typically, people only do this with Skull the Myrdain or the Helogrod Spiderwing featured instance, but sometimes you can find groups for other ones. They're just a little bit less efficient, less time efficient, so they're not run as much. And then another great way to get influx scrolls and crystals is through the Throne of the Dreadtear, and specifically tier 2 on that. A lot of groups will farm specifically the first boss, and the ancient Ithel coin currency that is dropped in that can be used to barter for scrolls and crystals. You can run the whole raid for more total currency and therefore like more scrolls and crystals. And also I should point out the fewer players in your group, that will actually allow each individual member to get more currency for barter. So a lot of groups do this with about 4 players actually at level 130. It's a level 105 raid. And they do that on tier 2 because the first boss is so quick. That is actually what is usually farmed, the first boss with that. And that is once per week because that raid has a weekly reset loot lock, and I believe it resets on Thursday for that. So that is a once a week activity basically, Throne of the Dreadtear to get scrolls and crystals through the barter currency. But outside of those 3 pieces of content, we talked about missions, featured instances, and then the Motes and Embers of Enchantment. But outside of those, just running group content in general can actually be decent for both scrolls and crystals just from like random drops, as well as epic battles and bartering stars of merit for those. Also, the roving threats gift givers bands can actually be used for to barter for scrolls of empowerment. But back to group content, instances are a great source of marks and medallions, and these can be used on Amphilis Scrolls of Empowerment, and it's actually a decent method, relatively decent. Although I know a lot of players like to spend their marks and medallions on Reputation Accelerator tomes instead, such as myself. I prioritize my marks and medallions on those. I find them very useful. But finally, a lot of landscape reputation barters have scrolls available for barter. But importantly, a lot of these are going to be of the max tier variety, so it's important to try to utilize these resources first to get your legacy tiers up to a certain point, up to the max tier basically, then move on to higher level landscape areas and keep using the new higher level max tiers. So that is actually a general strategy that I just recommend with the new max tier system anyway, to first use the lower max tier scrolls and utilize those as much before actually moving on to either higher max tier scrolls or uncapped Amphilis scrolls, because the higher tier ones, they will allow you after the point of the lower tier cap to progress after that. I know it's, to me, even saying it, it seems like a super confusing system. It used to not work this way, but that is a more recent update. But I do want to point out, setting that aside, there actually is one more method for obtaining scrolls and crystals, and depending on your resources, it could be the best option in the game, and that is the auction hall. Depending on your server, there will likely be lots of both crystals and scrolls available for purchase with in-game gold. The only concern is if you actually have enough gold for that to be a consistent way to get your scrolls and crystals. But I think it really can be a great option for just spending in-game gold in general, and I think this strategy is actually often overlooked by players, but for me, it is actually one of the better options because I don't have much else to really spend my in-game gold on. But that is all I have on my methods. Again, it was a very quick list of some things that I have found to be very effective as far as obtaining scrolls and crystals. And that is now all I have for this Imbued Legendary Item Guide. I really hope it helps players learn how simple of a process imbuing actually is with, again, getting the right legacies, then the scroll of delving, leveling to 70, then imbuing. But I do hope there's a lot of extra details in this video on both the process on imbued allies in general, and on legacies and the sources of scrolls and crystals. I hope all that was also helpful to you all. Again, if you have any questions on imbuing LI, the whole system, legacies, all that sort of stuff, please do comment below. And if you have any advice, I would also really appreciate if you could comment that as well. And with that, I hope you all enjoyed this video and at least learned something about the imbued allies. And if you did, please consider liking and subscribing for more, or becoming a channel member to support the content. And thanks for watching, everyone.